All right, so we're here to talk about Antifa. What is it and what's the truth? Because both the left and the right have been lying to you about this. Trump and a lot of the right wing commentators love to pretend like Antifa is some kind of a giant centralized terrorist organization being secretly funded by George Soros. Totally not anti Semitic, of course. Funded by George Soros or the DNC. That is fiction. There's no Antifa. That's what you keep hearing from left wing media, but that's not true. There's no Antifa headquarters. That is true. Nobody's clocking in for an Antifa paycheck. But the left is being dishonest also. When they say Antifa isn't real, it's just an idea, that's equally false. In fact, the most ignorant people about Antifa is going to be the left because I haven't seen anyone in left wing media be honest about Antifa. They all, pretty much every time they mention Antifa, they immediately go on to say it's not a real thing, it's just an idea, it's just an ideology. So if you ask the average left winger who's not a far left extremist, they can't even name one Antifa cell. But there are many. Rose City Antifa is one of them, right? Think about this. The right wing is far more educated about Antifa than the left is. And that's a sad state of affairs. Now, obviously, a lot of the normie right wingers don't know anything about Antifa. They just know what they're being told by people like Trump who are claiming it's a big headquarters and blah. But the people who are really political and involved, they know the names of these groups. They know what they've done. They know their tactics. Meanwhile, the average left winger, no idea because it's being covered up, right? It is an ideology, anti-fascism, but it's also a movement that has real groups. You know, these real groups operate under a banner. Groups like Rose City Antifa in Portland, which has been around since 2007. You got Berkeley Antifa, Antifa Anti-Fascist. You got Smash, Racism DC, and Torch Antifa Network. These aren't Reddit threads. They're organized crews with online hubs, encrypted chats, meeting spots, and street level tactics. And before we continue, I want to mention one thing that is very relevant here. One man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. Always remember that. Think about groups that you think of that are terrorist groups across the globe and consider for a moment that to other people, those terrorist groups are freedom fighters, right? Are there terrorist groups that you believe are fighting for your freedom, perhaps fighting against fascism? So to you, you don't see them as terrorists when they're demonstrably terrorists? Stay with me. We're going to get more into that. So their playbook is usually, it looks like they do something called black bloc. That's basically all in black, cover their faces and things like that. They got shields, gas masks. They use fireworks, laser pointers, and the old, reliable brick to the face, right? They swarm, they disrupt, they hit hard, then melt back into the crowd. The goal is to make it impossible for what they see as fascists to speak or operate. I think a little weirdo freak called Andy No will tell you all about that, but that's a story for another video. Mr. Tim Pool, or Dim, was it Dim? Or whatever. You know what I'm talking about. Mr. Beanie Guy. He knows this guy very well. Anyway, so during the 20 situation, they were at their peak, especially after the George Floyd death. We saw cities like Portland, Seattle, Minneapolis, go through months of riots. Federal courthouses were attacked night after night. I covered it on my channel live, right? So this is not just a made up thing. What's made up is Fox News playing those clips as if it's happening now. But Antifa and many of these far left extremist groups have been really quiet in the last few years. I mistakenly said since Trump, but it's not since Trump. They quieted down years before Trump got elected for the second term. But when they were very active and they were engaged in basically domestic terrorism and violence and attacking police and putting hundreds of police in the hospital, I covered it on my channel. We saw them on video, what they actually do. So David Pakman, Brian Tyler Cohen, the Young Turks, all of these left-wing channels that are pretending they don't exist, they're lying to you. So basically, they were attacking these courthouses night after night. Police precincts were firebombed, businesses burned down. Over 2,000 police officers across the U.S. were injured in the line of duty that summer. Hundreds ended up in hospitals. Some were hit with frozen water bottles and explosives, and commercial-grade fireworks, and others got hit with bricks, pipes, and Molotovs. I literally saw this stuff. Again, it's all on video. The same way the right wing pretends like the domestic terrorists that attacked our Capitol on January 6th, like it didn't really happen and it was Antifa and all this kind of stuff. The left wing does the exact same thing, right? There was a lot of violence that was directed towards police officers back in those riots. And I think it was at the same level or similar level to what you saw in January 6th, although January 6th was far more serious of an event. I mean, me attacking a police station versus a local police station versus maybe attacking local FBI building. There's levels, right? And the ultimate level would be obviously the White House, and right, before that would be, the Capitol, right? The fact that they went there and did what they did on January 6th, that was far more serious of an attack on America than anything that Antifa has ever done. But Antifa does the same type of thing, just on a much lower level. And I would say the carnage is a lot lower level. The frequency much higher, because they were doing this for nights and nights. I mean, this was like months of doing this. When you look at the amount of violence that the right-wing extremists demonstrated in just one day during the Capitol attack, compared to, I mean, what they did in one day would be the equivalent of the level of violence that Antifa did in months. Like, it would take months for Antifa to get anywhere near that level of violence that these right-wingers did in one day. I think the numbers as well, I don't think I've ever seen anything close to that amount of far left extremists in terms of Antifa, gathering like that. Obviously, you would see Black Lives Matter, and they do engage in some of these tactics, but really, in terms of the real violent ones, the ones involved in terrorism, very small groups. But you saw a much larger group of people that were very violent on January 6th. But anyway, so the reality is, yes, in fact, Antifa was very much part of the chaos that we saw in 20. Not all of it, but plenty of it. There were also moments where Antifa-aligned protesters teamed up with Black Lives Matter activists, like the Chicago ambush in 20, which I covered on my channel as well. That was not covered in mainstream media. Definitely wasn't covered in left-wing media. A lot of this stuff gets suppressed and covered up and hidden from the general public. But it is facts that it happened. Just like how a lot of right-wingers are very ignorant about a lot of stuff that happened on January 6th, even though it was the most broadcast and video recorded incident probably in history. Just like how they're ignorant of that, the left and liberals broadly are very ignorant about Antifa, what they have done, because again, it's being suppressed by their media. So in that incident that I covered, the Chicago ambush, basically that was where crowds lured the officers into an attack situation where they were throwing projectiles at them. The city leader admitted or claimed that this was a level of coordination that they had not seen previously. It was basically an organized strike. So let's be fair. However, the right wing has its own extremists as well. You got Boogaloo Boys, Proud Boys, you got Oath Keepers. They've got militias that train with rifles and body armor. Their violence tends to be bigger. Bombs, plots, and yes, January 6th. Right-wing extremists kill more people overall. That is absolutely true. You're not going to see a lot of guns when it comes to Antifa. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen an Antifa member with a gun in terms of the riots. Now, we'll talk more about some of the violence when we'll talk about some of the convictions and things like that. We're not just throwing stuff out there like the right-wing liars. But generally speaking, they're not really big on guns. They're more big on pipes and the things that I mentioned earlier. Right-wingers, guns. They training like they're training for war. They're literally training for war. They talk about civil war and all this kind of stuff. So they are, by design, more violent, right? I mean, when you're training for war and you're using guns and you're practicing shooting in the woods with fatigues and all this kind of stuff. And then you got Antifa, who is, talking about tactics of like throwing bricks and rocks and using laser pointers. I mean, it's not hard to figure out which one is more violent, right? The guys with the guns or the guys with the laser pointers? I'll let you figure that one out. But, that fact doesn't make left-wing extremism harmless, right? Extremism it's a bipartisan thing. It's not a left-wing thing or it's not a right-wing thing. It's a human thing. People with unstable minds and inflated egos and deep resentment who get wrapped around in a political cause until violence feels justified. You've got, far left extremists who think they're revolutionaries fighting fascism. You've got far right extremists who think they're patriots defending the Constitution, and both sides use the words of fascist and patriot to make themselves feel righteous while doing awful things. That's not to say that there aren't people who, there are these Antifa groups and there's people who claim the ideology of Antifa. So there are people who are anti-fascists, who are against fascism, and we see fascism rising in the country. We're not talking about them. We're talking about the ones actually engaged in terrorism, even though on a lighter scale. They basically operate like terror cells. When people talk about that they don't have a solid structure and they're a loose network, that's how terrorist cells operate, right? And that is a tactic to avoid getting caught, right? So right-wing media, they'll pretend like all the violence is on the left. Left-wing media pretends Antifa doesn't exist at all. Both are lying, right? Because the truth is inconvenient for their brand. Now, I want to tell you the real story. Antifa started decades ago, tracing its roots back to the anti-Nazi movements in the 1930s and punk scene in the 1980s. It came to the US through underground networks and anarchists and anti-racist skinheads. But over time, it evolved. It became a culture, not just a cause. And it feeds on confrontation, right? Today, most Antifa groups see law enforcement itself as the enemy. The state arm of fascism, I guess is how they would refer to it. That's why their violence usually targets police, not civilians, right? Now, compare that to the right wing groups. Those targets tend to be government institutions, minorities, or political opponents. Literally saw Democrats killed in their homes recently. So they're the opposite ends of the same sickness. Different enemies, same disease, radicalization, right? When you combine extreme political identity with unstable psychology, you get chaos. And America has a lot of unstable people right now. That is without a doubt. Unstable people and people that lack a lot of critical thinking, for sure. So that's how we keep seeing the new movements popping up that look like they look noble at first, right? Like Black Lives Matter, right? I was very suspicious very early on. I started talking about it. In the end, it turns out my suspicions were warranted, but they did appear noble to me, as they did to many people in the beginning. But they turned out to be destructive once they collide with reality. So the truth is, Antifa exists. It's not one group, it's many. It's not all terrorists, but it includes them. And if you only look at the violence from one side, you're never going to understand what's actually tearing the country apart. So here's where it gets dangerous, because right now, Donald Trump is hungry to expose left-wing extremist groups. He and his allies want to paint all the violence as coming from the left. He's already acting lawlessly, going after his political opponents, even indicting Democrats. So if there's anything at all to expose about these Antifa groups, he's going to do it. And when he does, it's going to look terrible for the left. After years of saying Antifa is just an idea, imagine what the centrists and the normies are going to think when they find out that Antifa is real, that they've been organizing, rioting, and getting arrested, and that the left-wing media just pretends they don't exist. That's not going to make people trust the left. It's going to drive them straight to Trump, as we've seen in the past. This is not a new thing, right? We've seen how the right-wing movement has been growing. Look at the power they have. They've taken over our government. Part of how they got there is because of things like this. You're opening up Pandora's box, which enables these right-wing savages in the media, like Ben Shapiro and Tim Pool, to trick people to their side. So let's be honest. And it's also very likely that some of these groups have foreign fingerprints on them. I don't have proof, but it would be naive to think otherwise. Any hostile government that wants to divide this country, Russia, China, Iran, they'll be foolish not to target our extremists. If you want to break America from within, you fund the radicals, left or right. We've already seen right-wing influencers getting funded by Russian propaganda networks, people like Tim Pool and Dave Rubin cozying up to Kremlin narratives. So why would anyone believe the left hasn't been infiltrated too? If I were a foreign country trying to divide America, I'd definitely be targeting social media heavily. Building up something like TikTok would be my dream, getting mass adoption in the US in that way. But specific people that I'll be targeting, absolutely number one on my list is right-wing extremists. But number two would be left-wing extremists, pandering to them, pretending to be on their side, funding them directly or indirectly. So again, why would anyone believe the left hasn't been infiltrated, just like the right wing has? Does that make any sense to you, that they would only target the right? Don't be stupid. We've literally seen far-left personalities appear on Russia Today and Sputnik spreading Kremlin talking points. I know that's sort of a talking point to dismiss some of the things that they do mention, Russia. But the key to good propaganda is to base a lot of truth. You start with some truth and you use that to lead people astray, right? So yes, dishonest people are talking about Russia to silence them, but there is some truth to the Russian narrative, as we saw with Trump literally colluding with Russia during that election, even though half the country believes it never happened and the other half believes that it affected the election in a major way, which it did not. But anyway, we've also seen some of the socialists and communists in America praising China, a country that runs concentration camps and censors dissidents. Some have even defected to Russia. So the idea that the far left is completely clean, completely untouched by foreign influence is ridiculous. And when those connections eventually get exposed, guess who looks vindicated? Think about that for a second. Trump finds some actual far left extremist groups and find out that they have ties to a foreign country. They are going to absolutely it's going to be running on a loop for months. How is the left going to look after months of pretending like Antifa doesn't exist? So they're lying about Antifa, acting like it's some big group, George Soros, whatever. The left is just completely denying that and that they even exist. Then when he comes out with facts, like here's an actual Antifa group, here are funding coming from these foreign countries, people are going to hear that and they're going to assume that the entire narrative comes from Trump is true, and they're going to assume that the left is just lying about everything, and that's going to be new subscribers for Ben Shapiro and those other predators, right? He gets to walk out and say, see, I told you the radical left was a real threat, and millions of Americans will believe him because the left has been lying and covering it up. That's the real danger here. Not just the extremists themselves, but the dishonesty that protects them. Because when the truth finally surfaces, it doesn't just expose Antifa, it exposes the entire media on the left, mainstream media, liberal, independent liberal media, progressive media, right? When they're pretending that it's not real, and that's how people are going to move to the right. So if you want to help out the right wing, keep doing what you're doing. So yeah, Antifa exists, but so do right-wing extremists. And until we're willing to be honest about all of it, this country is going to keep tearing itself apart. One side pretending to be holy, the other pretending to be patriotic, both blind to their own extremists. Because pretending the problem doesn't exist doesn't make it go away. It just makes it easier for someone like Trump to weaponize it. So Antifa is real. It's time to start acknowledging it. The response from the left-wing media should not be that Antifa is just an ideology, it's not real, that he's making it up. It should instead be, yes, Antifa is real, and we condemn the violence that they've done in the past, but they have not been doing much lately at all. The people in the streets, they're not George Soros funded. These are Americans who love their country and are fighting for their country. This is certainly what they believe. And Antifa is just not part of the story right now. And even if they were, they're not a single group. There are separate groups that do have organization. They do have some kind of funding structure. I don't think it's George Soros, but they do have funding, obviously. And some of them, who knows who they're tied to, right? But as principled leftists or progressives or whatever you are, you should be calling them out. Don't be like the right wing, right? Look at how I think we got to where we are. There is a growing movement of far-right extremists, and the normie conservatives just ignored them, pretended they didn't exist. Focus on the left has gone too far, right? Remember, you had QAnon, you had the original MAGA movement growing, and these people were so radical, doing such ridiculous things. And the normie conservatives, they basically enabled this behavior. And now these extremists are in our government. They are ICE officers. They are politicians, right? So keep on pretending these people don't exist and enabling their violence and criminal behavior. And one day, unfortunately, potentially very soon, you're going to suffer some real consequences. The right-wing movement is a movement based on lies. The left needs to lead by example and be honest. Don't go down the route of the right wing, right? You can't spend all this time criticizing them if you're going to do the same thing they do. Call out your extremists. Show them how it's done.